Initially I had entitled this message, What's the Charge? It seemed like a good title considering, Jesus gets arrested, right? And, I don't know, I've never been arrested. Maybe some of you have. Maybe you know this better than me. I've never been arrested. But I would want to know, what's the charge? That would be my first question, what's the charge? However, the more I studied this passage, it became apparent to me that really wasn't the focus of this passage. The focus isn't what the charge is or anything like that. It's interesting because every Wednesday morning there's a few guys I meet with, so we work on our sermons together, and we were talking about this passage, and I said, well, I told them what my title was, and then we kind of went back and forth over it, and then Scott, who we always, if we get a chance to poke each other with a stick, we will, and he says, did you even read this passage? And of course, sometimes you just miss the point. Anybody ever do that? Miss the point? For me, so we're preaching from John chapter 18. A little side note here. I noticed that I always give the worship leaders the title of the sermon and the passage beforehand, and all the songs they picked were about the real point of the sermon and not the title that I gave them. So they completely ignored me on that and did the right thing. So chapter 18 focused on four primary characters. First of all, of course, is Jesus, right? Jesus is the main character in almost every book of the Bible. Then there's the second, Judas, the famous, infamous betrayer of Christ. He's in this. And then we have Annas, the high priest, who is also the father-in-law of the high priest. And that's just so you know, that's not, so that's going to see. And then we have Peter, one of the 12 disciples. Those are the four main characters that stand up. Now, this passage is kind of interesting because it's easy to read it like a basic narrative. Like a narrative is just a story going along, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Like somebody says, tell me about your day, and you just kind of give them the narrative of the day. You tell them one event after the other. It's easy to read this passage like it's just a narrative that moving between Jesus' teaching, which is obviously really important, to the crucifixion, which again is crucial to everything we know about Jesus. And then there's this passage between those two, that we think it's just a bridge. It's a bridge that tells us what happened during this time. But here's the thing. John is very intentional about what he says. And so sometimes a bridge isn't just a way to get from one place to another. Sometimes it has a point. Sometimes it's really important. So we need to consider that today. See, everything with John connects in one way or another to his main purpose, which is he writes about in John chapter 20. He says, but these things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. I've said that about 100 times in the last year, but this is what John says. This is why I'm writing this. So John has spent a lot of time talking about Jesus, the signs that Jesus performed, and how that points to who he is as God's Son, creator of the earth, one with God, in the beginning with God. And then he talks about this glorious Son and how amazing he is and the glories of him. That's been the last half. And then John invites us to embrace this life-giving belief. This is life, he says, to embrace this truth. And as he's doing that, John includes in that, there's a subtext all the way through this, that this includes the challenges that we face in getting there. And so because John writes this to a first century audience, we sometimes have to rethink things. He says, you need to understand that believing in Jesus will be met with resistance. Believing in Jesus will have its trouble. So this is a thread that goes all the way through John that shows up in here. So we're going to read the entire 27 verses of this section here. It's a bit long, but just follow along, and I want you to pay attention to the characters and what's happening with them. John 18, 1 through 27. If you have your Bibles, you can follow along on your phone apps or whatever you're following on. John 8, and it'll also be on the screen behind me. When he, Jesus, had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. We know that to be the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Now, Judas, who betrayed him, knew this place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they were carrying torches and lanterns and weapons. Now Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with him. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back, and they fell to the ground. It's kind of an impressive scene, don't you think? And again he asked them, so Jesus asked them again, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. In my mind, I hear them being a little more hesitant, a little more timid, about this. And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. And if you're looking for me, then let these men go." And this happened so the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, and he struck the high priest's servant, cutting off the right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. Then the detachment of soldiers and Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink from the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with their commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus, and they bound him. And they brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders, some time ago, we saw that in John, the Jewish leaders, that it would be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and the other disciple were following Jesus, because this disciple was known to the high priest. He went in with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. So he didn't get in. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back and spoke to the servant girl on duty there and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and the officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was standing there with him, warming himself. And meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his teaching, about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I have always taught in the synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, aren't you?" And he denied it, saying, "I'm not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" And again Peter denied it, and at that moment the rooster began to crow. So we have this little band of people, the disciples, heading off to their favorite prayer spot, a garden of, just a few hundred meters outside of the walls of Jerusalem. And they're accosted by this cadre of soldiers with torches and lanterns and swords and weapons and it's the religious leaders and their officials. It's the Pharisees, of course, and they've been led there by Judas. But here's the thing: John kind of leaves Judas in the background. He barely mentions with Judas, other than to say he led them there. He doesn't even mention the kiss. So that's how far Judas is in the background of this passage. Nor does John mention any of the soldiers by name. There's no names mentioned until he gets to Annas, other than the high priest's servant Malchus. And this Annas, who is a father-in-law of the high priest, and he's also called the high priest. Now, this isn't some hillbilly relationship thing going on here. Just, nor is Peter confused. See, here's what happens. When you were made high priest by the Jewish law, you were high priest until you died. The Romans, however, thought it was convenient for them to appoint a high priest that was more according to their liking. So they appointed Caiaphas, the son-in-law of Annas, to be the high priest. So in the Jewish eyes, he would always be the high priest, even though he was actually former high priest. So that's the confusion there. That's why the words get mixed up a little bit. But then he gets to the questions. He doesn't give a lot of detail about the questions. He asks them about the disciples and about what he taught. That's pretty vague, don't you think? Especially if you're talking about charges that are going to lead to somebody's death. He's pretty vague. He doesn't really... John does highlight a couple things. He highlights the conversation, the impact of Jesus on the arresting soldiers, and he comments on Peter's behavior. This seems to be the priority of John's record of Jesus' arrest. Why? Yeah, this doesn't really make sense. You know, we're talking about the climax of the mission of Jesus, and John is talking to this first century audience, and they're leaning in. Okay, well, this is colossal. This is the battle between Jesus, the Son of God, and the evil religious leaders, the opponents. And so you get this beautiful climax. You know, good storytelling always draws attention to the villain and the hero, right? And John says, I know you want to hear all about the confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees and the religious leaders. He says, I know you want to hear that, but you really need to hear what's going on with Peter. What? Why? Why Peter? Why? And John says, because there's a lot of Peter in all of us. There's a lot of Peter in all. Like we're all a lot like Peter, who has an amazing ability to miss the point. Because more important than hearing about Jesus winning over the religious leaders is hearing about how a guy like Peter can go from missing the point to truly seeing and living in the life in the Son of Jesus, and living in the truth. How he can go from missing the point to being a leader of the truth. I have a book on my shelf in my office, and I've always loved it. It was a good book too, but the title always captured my imagination. And I realized it didn't just capture my imagination, it often captured my reality. And the title of the book was Adventures in Missing the Point. Adventures in Missing the Point. Does that sound like anybody else's reality here? Yeah, you know, so I think men are particularly good at this. And so when we're young, and I know it probably doesn't saying, well, it's not just when we're young, but when we're young and we're easily deluded into thinking that we really know how to impress the ladies, right? And so sometimes the dates we think were brilliant. We look back and we realize, oh, I was so stupid. And then even worse is when we start to recount the prowess of a romantic, like significant, like my biggest faux pas was, and I think maybe ever, was sharing with my friends about taking Edith on this date before we were married to this romantic restaurant in Calgary. It was the pinnacle of romantic restaurants in Calgary. Perched on the hills on the west side of Calgary, you had the city lights to the east. You had the Rocky Mountains to the west, high lit by the setting sun. In the picture. And in this restaurant, the food was exquisite. It was so good. Everything was good. The service was so attentive. They had musicians would come and play romantic music at your table, violins. And so I was telling people about this beautiful, the name, Romeo and Juliet. Some of you guys are feeling a little impressed with me. I get a little impressed just telling the story, except for I didn't remember how it ended. So I was telling this story, and this beautiful memory, and then Edith kind of clears her throat, because she's there as I'm telling the story, and she clears her throat and says, the problem is, I wasn't there. That was some other girlfriend. so it was like, oops. The worst thing is, I told the story twice, two different times. I forgot the first time and told it again, and she had to twice. Adventures in missing the point. We are masters of missing the point, and some of us are better than others. I know that. And Peter was one of those ones who was always missing the point. He was a master. The night before Jesus predicted his death, when Jesus was predicting his death, Jesus says, you guys will all abandon me. And Peter says, I will not abandon, I will lay down my life for you, right? I will lay down my life for you. And it appears in the Garden of Gethsemane that he's ready to do that, right? There's this band of soldiers. They've got weapons. The disciples, we know from an earlier passage, they had two swords between all of them. Peter has one, and he grabs it. The odds are against him. And he finds the nearest ear to cut off. I don't think he was aiming for the ear. I think Malchus ducked. I think that's what happened. I don't think he was aiming for the ear, but he cuts off his ear. Tell you how the details fade in the background here. John doesn't mention that Jesus healed his ear. He just moves on. All the other guy says, oh, by the way, Jesus healed his ear. Jesus put his ear back on. It was amazing. It's a miracle. John doesn't bother with that. He just carries on. You cut off his ear because he's trying to point out how badly Peter misses the point. And so then they get into, and you kind of feel bad for Peter. This other disciple, we don't know who he is, doesn't give his name, but everybody thinks it's probably John because he always refers to himself as the other disciple. And he doesn't mention, so this other disciple apparently knew the high priest. So he can go in the courtyard. The high priest's court was a beautiful space. And so they're in there, people are gathered around, you got a bonfire going in there. Peter, you feel bad, like he's kind of just blowing it in the garden, getting it all mixed up. And then he doesn't even get to go into, he's got to wait outside. Have you ever been the guy who had to wait outside because you didn't really belong? Ever been that person? It sucks to be that person. And so that was Peter. So Peter messes up in the garden. He comes there. He doesn't even qualify to get in. John has to come in and say, I talked to some people. We can come on in. So John gets him back in. And then he gets there and he's asked the question, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Hey, aren't you the guy with Jesus? Aren't you the guy with Jesus? And we don't know what happened to Peter. 1 minute, he's talking a big game. I will die for you. And that's it. He's modeling that, and it seems in every way. I will die for you. I'm going to take on this cadre of soldiers for you, Jesus. And the next minute, he's saying, listen, I don't even know what this guy is. Now, to be fair, he may have been struggling with who Jesus was. When you think about it. He thought Jesus was going to be the ruler. That he was going to overthrow the government and establish the kingdom of God there on earth with himself as the leader. And here he was submitting himself to his soldiers, to these future executioners, without a fight. You got to think Peter saying, I'm not sure I even know who this guy is. I thought I did, but it's not fitting the boxes I had in mind. It's not working. I'm confused. You ever kind of sometimes have a conversation with somebody? I don't even know you. You're not the person I thought you were. I don't expect those answers from you. So it's a perfect passage for all of us who've ever said, how could I possibly miss the point so badly? It's a perfect passage for us who said, sometimes say, I'm so confused. This faith thing isn't at all what I thought it would be. It's a perfect passage for people who ask those questions. It's a perfect passage to say, God has got to be so disappointed with me. I feel I have it all wrong. See, this adventure in missing the point is not one of the fun adventures. But the good news is still right in front of us. The answer was right in front of Peter the whole time. And waking up to its reality is often a turbulent journey that turns our expectations inside out and upside down. It cracks open the containers that we become so comfortable with and the frameworks that are just too small for God. One of the ancient fathers, Gregory of Nyssa, said it well. He said, only wonder understands. Concepts create idols. Only wonder understands. Concepts create idols. See, when we finally trip over ourselves and the concepts we created and all the expectations of what we think church is and what religious life is like, and when we stumble over kind of these kind of boxes we built, we actually find ourselves stumbling into Jesus. And we discover the wonder of who Jesus is. I love the songs we picked. They were all about wonder. I don't know if you noticed that. Just that I'm being amazed at the foot of Jesus for what he's done. Peter kept tripping over his concepts about who the Messiah was. But in a word, even the opponents of Jesus were thrown on their knees when Jesus said, I am he. That phrase he spoke earlier, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. Think about it. Peter thought bold promises and death-defying bravery were the key to ushering in the new kingdom that Jesus was talking about. And Jesus said, why would I need a sword when simply by a word from my mouth, my would-be opponents fall to their knees? Why would I need a sword? Is there bravery and boldness in following Jesus? Yeah, of course it is. But it shows up differently than the bravado this world talks about. It shows in Jesus' courage to go through the journey before him. Shall I not drink from the cup my Father has given me? That's boldness. That's courage. And somebody would say, how did they still arrest him when he said, at a word, he says, I am he, and they all fall back. How did they actually arrest him? It's because Jesus gave them permission. Jesus gave them permission. Because they would kind of all fall back, and he asked a second time, who is it you're looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. He's already answered that question. And then what does he says? Let the rest of these go and take me. Jesus gave them permission to arrest him. We often picture it much more violently than that, don't we? And then he offers himself and sets his servants, his disciples, free. And then even in the face of the high priest, he speaks calmly. He's clearly unafraid of the power that Annas has. And Caiaphas next. And then in the face of the high priest, he just speaks calmly and clearly. Because he knows full well the journey that's in front of him, that he has chosen for himself. This glorious one, the eternal I Am, is in our midst, whose love and whose sacrifice call us to walk in wonder and worship. He calls us to walk in wonder and worship. And that's the simple truth. We are in the presence of the one whom our best response is to bow in wonder, to fall back at the sound of his voice and worship, surrender our lives completely to him. That's the simple truth. Father in heaven, we come before you, acknowledging that we've got our own categories and boxes and systems that we want to use to manage our faith and our life and our worlds. And we come before you and offer them to you to say, we know they're too small for you. Heal us from our misadventures and bring us back to you who is the point. In Jesus' name, amen.